It started with a roar that made the ground tremble, the kind of sound that made every head turn skyward. The German pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Mayer, had heard hundreds of engines before, BMWs, Daimlers, Junkers, but this one was different. Deep, growling, and raw. It didn't sound like the precise hum of German engineering. It sounded untamed, and it belonged to the enemy. The Americans called it the Thunderbolt, the P-47. And now, for the first time, Hans was going to fly one. The story begins in late 1944, somewhere on the outskirts of occupied France. A nearly intact P-47 Thunderbolt had been captured after a forced landing in German-controlled territory. Its pilot had bailed out, and the aircraft lay bruised but not broken. The Luftwaffe engineers couldn't believe their luck. The Allies' most formidable fighter in their hands. Within hours, the orders came from Berlin. Get it to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's secret testing base. The same airfield where Germany had tested the Me-262 jet, the Focke-Wulf 190 prototypes, and other machines of death. But this one was different. It was the machine that had terrorized their skies. When Hans arrived, he didn't expect much. German propaganda had painted the Thunderbolt as a heavy, sluggish brute. The real threat, they said, came from the agile Spitfires, or the nimble Mustangs. But the moment he saw the American fighter up close, his skepticism started to crack. The thing was massive, more like a flying tank than a plane. Its radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800, was an engineering monster. The armor plating was thick, the wings broad, the fuselage fat and confident. It looked indestructible. He ran his hand along the metal surface, still bearing bullet holes from its last fight. "The Americans built this to survive," one of the mechanics muttered. "They were used to sleek machines, fast but fragile." The Thunderbolt felt like it could smash through a wall and keep flying. When they fired up the engine for the first time, everyone stepped back. The propeller spun with a deep, throaty thunder that made even the veteran test pilots uneasy. It wasn't elegant, but it was powerful. Hans felt it in his chest, like standing next to a caged beast. The first flight was supposed to be short, just a few loops, basic maneuvers, then back down. But from the moment the wheels left the ground, Hans knew he was flying something extraordinary. The Thunderbolt climbed with unexpected grace for its size. It wasn't twitchy like a Bf-109. It was stable, solid, like it didn't care about turbulence or crosswinds. At high altitudes, where most planes struggled for air, the turbocharged engine kept pulling with relentless force. By the time Hans hit 25,000 feet, the P-47 was still accelerating. He realized then what American pilots had known for months. This wasn't a fighter built for finesse. It was built to dominate the vertical fight, to dive, strike, and survive. German planes danced. This one punched. When he pushed the throttle forward, the aircraft screamed down toward the ground, hitting speeds his Messerschmitt could only dream of. The dive felt endless. He pulled back hard, expecting the wings to tremble or the frame to shudder. But the Thunderbolt didn't even flinch. It cut through the air like a falling boulder, steady, confident. At 500 miles per hour, it still obeyed his every move. Hans later described that moment as like flying an iron god. Back on the ground, the engineers surrounded him. They peppered him with questions. How was it in a climb? Did it handle like they said? How did the cockpit feel? He didn't answer right away. He just sat there, staring at the machine, sweat dripping down his neck. Then he said quietly, "It's not beautiful, but it's perfect." What he meant was that the Thunderbolt wasn't designed to impress. It was designed to endure. The armor plating that Germans mocked as unnecessary weight saved countless American pilots' lives. The oversized engine that looked clumsy to German eyes gave it unmatched high-altitude power. And the rugged frame that seemed overbuilt made it nearly impossible to bring down with small-caliber fire. As Hans tested it more over the following days, he began to see why the Luftwaffe feared it more than they admitted. The Thunderbolt's strength wasn't just in speed or firepower, it was in its psychology. It gave its pilots confidence, the kind that made them fight harder and longer. Hans had been trained to think of war as a contest of skill, but here was proof that sometimes brute engineering could outsmart genius. He even noted how American pilots must have felt inside it. The cockpit was roomy, almost comfortable, something unheard of in German aircraft. Visibility was excellent. The controls, though heavier, were responsive, and the radio system, crystal clear. Germans had always underestimated the value of communication in air combat, but here it was, a cockpit built not just for flying, but for thinking, coordinating, surviving. On his third test flight, Hans tried something daring. He simulated a dogfight against a captured Focke-Wulf 190 flown by another test pilot. The 190, known for its agility, easily turned inside the Thunderbolt at low speeds. But when Hans used the P-47's superior dive and climb, everything changed. The German fighter couldn't follow. It lost energy too quickly, while the Thunderbolt kept its momentum like a descending meteor. Within seconds, Hans was behind his opponent, mock guns aimed. He couldn't help but grin. The heavy American brute had just outplayed one of Germany's finest. After landing, he wrote in his flight log, "The Americans have found the future of warfare. Survivability over elegance." And that single sentence would be quoted in Luftwaffe memos for months to come. But there was something deeper brewing in Hans's mind. As he studied the plane more, he realized it wasn't just about the aircraft, it was about the philosophy behind it. The Americans weren't designing for duels. They were designing for war, for production, for reliability, for mass. Every bolt, every panel screamed of standardization. If this plane was damaged, it could be fixed easily. If it was lost, another could roll off the assembly line within hours. Germany, on the other hand, was bleeding its soul into perfection. Each aircraft a masterpiece, but also a fragile work of art. The Americans were building tools. The Germans were building trophies. Hans began to understand why the Luftwaffe was losing. The Thunderbolt represented a mindset his country couldn't match anymore. One that valued durability over style, strategy over pride. Even its name, Thunderbolt, wasn't poetic. It was brutal, elemental, just like the war itself. He tested its armament next, the 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns. When he fired them, the recoil nearly startled him. The sky ahead was filled with a wall of lead, not precise like the 20mm cannons of his 109, but overwhelming. It didn't matter if you missed slightly. Something was going to get hit. It was the difference between a duelist's rapier and a soldier's machine gun. One was for art, the other was for killing. Hans would later confess to a fellow pilot that he felt uneasy flying it, not because it was hard to control, but because it was too good at what it did. It made killing impersonal, efficient, the kind of weapon that didn't ask questions. In the following weeks, reports from the front only reinforced his findings. Thunderbolts were tearing through German convoys, strafing trains, cutting supply lines, destroying tanks. Even when hit, they often limped back home, riddled with holes, engines coughing smoke, but still flying. Pilots told stories of returning with half their control surfaces gone, landing on one wheel, and still surviving. No German plane could take that kind of punishment and live to tell the tale. By December, Hans's detailed reports reached higher command. Some officers dismissed them, calling the P-47 a lumbering beast. Others, however, paid attention. The engineers in Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf began quietly studying the concept: how to integrate more rugged frames, better pilot protection, improved communication systems. But it was too late. The war machine of the Reich was already collapsing under its own weight, and the skies were no longer theirs. Hans kept flying the captured Thunderbolt until the day it could fly no more, until spare parts ran out and the fuel became too scarce. In those final test flights, he admitted to himself something he would never write down: that if he had to choose between a Messerschmitt and a Thunderbolt to go to war in, he'd pick the American. Because in that cockpit, he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like he might actually make it home. In the cold gray mornings of early 1945, the war felt like it was already over, even if no one dared to say it aloud. Germany's skies had become hunting grounds for the Allied air forces. And Hans Mayer, once one of the Luftwaffe's most confident test pilots, found himself haunted by a machine that technically belonged to the enemy. The P-47 Thunderbolt stood in the hangar like a sleeping monster, half cannibalized for spare parts, yet still commanding the kind of respect few aircraft ever earned. It was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a lesson, one Germany had learned too late. He often came back to it in silence. The mechanics had long since moved on to testing other aircraft, mostly desperate prototypes that promised the Reich's salvation, the Me-262 jet, the rocket-powered interceptors, designs that looked futuristic but felt rushed and unstable. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, felt ancient in design yet almost indestructible in purpose. It reminded Hans of something he could never quite articulate, that simplicity, when guided by brute logic, could defeat genius. One bitter morning, while inspecting the fuselage, he noticed something that struck him. The repair patches, hastily welded by German engineers, didn't line up with precision, yet the structure still held perfectly. The American engineers had designed the plane to forgive mistakes. It didn't need perfection to fly, it just needed to function. That was its secret. And that was America's secret, too. Hans started rereading his own notes. Words like forgiving, stable, and resilient appeared again and again. Not the words you'd find in German engineering manuals, which obsessed over precision and performance curves. But those qualities, resilience, adaptability, were the very things Germany lacked as the war ground toward its inevitable collapse. Still, he couldn't shake his pilot's curiosity. He wanted to push the Thunderbolt one last time, to feel what it could truly do, if unleashed. He knew he'd never get permission for a full combat simulation. The Reich's resources were too strained for such luxuries, so he did something quietly rebellious. He took the P-47 out himself, without authorization. The weather was terrible that day. Thick fog rolled over the airfield, and visibility barely stretched beyond the hangars. But he wanted to fly it not in ideal conditions, but in chaos. Exactly the kind of sky that defined the end of this war. The mechanics stared in disbelief as he taxied out. The Pratt & Whitney engine roared back to life, echoing through the empty airfield like thunder in a graveyard. As he lifted off, the fog swallowed him whole. Up there, above the clouds, it was pure silence. The world below was burning, columns of smoke from distant bombings, broken towns, black scars across Europe's body. But inside that cockpit, it was strangely peaceful. The controls responded like they were extensions of his own hands. He climbed higher, leveled off, and began testing maneuvers that no report had ever mentioned. Barrel rolls, split S-dives, sudden vertical climbs, things no pilot would attempt in a heavy fighter. But the P-47 handled it all. Not gracefully, but decisively. It moved like it was too stubborn to fail. Hans couldn't help but laugh. It was the kind of laughter that came from awe mixed with despair. "This is what we were fighting against," he muttered to himself. "And we never even understood it." He dove through a pocket of cloud, feeling the massive airframe tremble slightly as he passed through turbulence. The instruments flickered, the altimeter spun, but the aircraft never lost its poise. When he leveled out at low altitude, skimming over the snow-covered fields, he felt something primal, a connection not to an enemy's machine, but to a philosophy. The Thunderbolt didn't care about pride. It didn't chase elegance. It only cared about winning. Later that afternoon, when he landed, his commanding officer was waiting. Hans expected punishment for taking off unauthorized. Instead, the officer just looked at him, his expression tired and hollow. "Is it true?" he asked. "Is it really that good?" Hans didn't answer immediately. He simply pointed at the Thunderbolt's wings, each one riddled with repaired bullet holes, paint flaking, fuel lines patched with whatever they could find. "It's ugly," he said, "but it flies like it doesn't know it's supposed to be dead." That line spread quietly among the test crews, repeated like folklore, and in a way it mirrored the war itself. Germany was flying on fumes, its factories bombed, its pilots exhausted. But the Allies kept coming, relentless and self-sustaining, like the Thunderbolt. Over the next few weeks, Hans began working closely with German engineers to decode the P-47's systems. The turbo supercharger fascinated them most. Unlike most German engines, which relied on direct mechanical compression, this system used exhaust-driven turbines to maintain power even at high altitudes. It was an engineering marvel in its own right, and a logistical nightmare to copy. The materials alone were nearly impossible to source under the collapsing Reich. One engineer sighed as he examined the mechanism. "They can build thousands of these," he said, almost whispering. "We can barely build one." That realization hung in the air like a confession. The Americans hadn't just won the technological war, they'd won the industrial one. The Thunderbolt was a flying monument to that fact. Hans began to think of his country's downfall in a new way. It wasn't just about losing battles or making strategic errors. It was about being trapped by perfectionism. While Germany built machines to symbolize superiority, America built machines to secure survival. One made you proud, the other made you win. By February 1945, Hans's reports had become more candid. His final technical note on the P-47 wasn't filled with statistics or performance data, it was philosophical. He wrote, "The Thunderbolt is not a pilot's plane. It is a soldier's plane. It serves, obeys, and endures." That line later appeared in declassified post-war archives, astonishing Allied intelligence officers who read it years later. But while Hans studied his captured prize, the world around him was disintegrating. Rechlin was bombed repeatedly. Supplies vanished. Some pilots defected. Others refused to fly. The Me-262 jet fighters roared into the skies in small numbers, fast and lethal, but too few, too late. And still, the Thunderbolt kept appearing above them, hunting trains, smashing tanks, shredding columns. Every time Hans heard its distant growl, he recognized it instantly, not as an enemy, but as an inevitability. Then came the day the order was given to destroy all sensitive equipment. The P-47, now unserviceable due to lack of parts, was among the targets. Hans stood by as the mechanics placed demolition charges near the engine and fuel tanks. The irony hit him like a punch. The only plane that had truly impressed him in years, perhaps the only plane that had made him feel safe, was about to be blown apart by his own side. When the explosion went off, he felt something inside him break, not because of the destruction itself, but because of what it symbolized, the end of illusion. The Reich's arrogance, its obsession with dominance through fear and design, had been reduced to rubble. Meanwhile, the Americans, those industrial pragmatists, were still producing hundreds of Thunderbolts a month. In the final weeks of the war, as Hans retreated toward Germany's interior, he carried a small notebook filled with sketches and reflections from his time flying the captured aircraft. He wrote about the engine, the control feel, the absurd power in dives. But between the technical notes, you could sense something else creeping in: admiration, respect, even envy. The kind that comes when you realize your enemy understood something about the world that you didn't. Years later, after the war, Hans found himself in an American interrogation center. The officers weren't cruel. They just wanted to understand what the Luftwaffe had learned. When they asked him about the Thunderbolt, he smiled faintly and said, "It taught me more about America than any book could." One officer asked him to elaborate. Hans thought for a moment, then replied, "You fight wars like you build your planes, not for glory, but to make sure you can fight the next one." That statement made it into a report labeled German Pilot Insights, Post-War Debrief. It was filed, archived, and forgotten for decades. But for Hans, it became something like a philosophy of its own, a lesson born not from textbooks or ideology, but from the cockpit of an enemy machine that refused to die. After the war ended, Hans was released from captivity and returned to a homeland that barely resembled the one he'd left behind. The cities he knew were piles of dust. The factories that once produced the Reich's greatest aircraft were now hollowed-out skeletons, silent reminders of ambition turned to ash. Yet, in all that ruin, one memory kept haunting him, not of battles or victories or losses, but of that single flight, high above the clouds, in the belly of the captured P-47 Thunderbolt. He tried to rebuild a life in civilian aviation, as so many former pilots did. But in every conversation, every engineering meeting, he found himself comparing everything to that American machine. German aircraft builders were starting from scratch under Allied supervision, designing passenger planes, transport aircraft, anything that would pass the occupation's regulations. But the new engineers, young, optimistic, had no idea what it had been like to stare down an enemy whose machines were built not for pride, but for purpose. When Hans spoke of the Thunderbolt's design philosophy, they listened politely, but they didn't understand. To them, it was just a relic of war. To Hans, it was the future that Germany never managed to reach. Years later, when American air shows began touring post-war Europe, Hans finally saw one again. It was painted silver and clean, shining under the sunlight. Children ran to it, pointing at its massive engine and thick wings. To them, it looked almost cartoonish, too bulky, too old-fashioned. But Hans stood there quietly, staring at it, like one might look at a ghost. The announcer was boasting about its role in World War II, how it escorted bombers deep into German territory, how it became the backbone of the Allied air power. The crowd clapped. Hans didn't. He just felt a heavy sadness in his chest, because he knew what it felt like from the inside. He remembered the vibration of that engine, the stability of its wings, the forgiving controls. He remembered how it made him feel both powerless and safe, all at once. And he remembered what it revealed to him, that the Americans had found a way to combine brute force with strategic wisdom. It wasn't just technology, it was mindset. What really amazed him was how the Thunderbolt had evolved even after the war. He read about it in Aviation magazines, how the Americans had used the same rugged design philosophy in later jets, how the P-47's spirit, survivability, reliability, standardization became the blueprint for the next generation of warplanes. Meanwhile, Germany's aviation heritage fractured, its brilliant minds scattered across the world, building for whoever would hire them. The Americans and the Soviets scooped them up, turned their genius into jet engines, rockets, missiles. But the soul of the P-47, that philosophy of endurance through brute engineering, became the dominant voice of the New World. Hans would often tell people that the P-47 wasn't a plane, it was an attitude. The Germans had been perfectionists. The Americans were pragmatists. One sought beauty, the other sought victory, and that, he said, was why one collapsed and the other conquered. He was invited once to an aviation conference in the early 1950s. There, a former U.S. pilot, an older man with kind eyes and the same weathered look Hans carried, recognized his name from the archives. "You're the one who flew our Thunderbolt in Rechlin, aren't you?" the American asked. Hans nodded. The man smiled, a mix of curiosity and pride. "What did you think of her?" Hans thought for a moment, then said, "She wasn't graceful, but she never let me down." The American laughed softly. "That's exactly what we said." They ended up talking for hours. Two men who had been enemies once, now bonded by their understanding of the same machine. Hans learned things he'd never known about the Thunderbolt's creation, how Republic Aviation had built it under insane pressure, how the engineers fought for thicker armor, even when generals complained about weight, how they designed it to bring pilots home, not just win fights. Every part of it had been made with one question in mind: how do we keep them alive long enough to win the war? When Hans heard that, he felt a quiet admiration that bordered on envy. Because that was something the German war machine had never asked. They built aircraft to win glory, to symbolize superiority, to dazzle. But no one had built them simply to endure. The American told him stories of P-47 pilots who limped back home on one engine, wings shredded, holes punched clean through the fuselage, yet still landed safely. He talked about ground attack missions, where the Thunderbolts flew so low that the heat from their exhaust melted the paint on tanks. He told him how the Germans called them juggernauts, because no matter how many times they hit them, they just kept coming. And that word, juggernaut, stuck with Hans, because it was exactly what he'd felt when he first took off in that captured Thunderbolt. The sense that this wasn't a fighter plane, it was an unstoppable force of will disguised as metal. It didn't belong to any one man. It belonged to the idea of persistence itself. Years later, long after both men retired, Hans wrote an article for a small aviation journal in Switzerland. The title was simple: "The Machine That Taught Me Humility." In it, he described the Thunderbolt not as a marvel of beauty or agility, but as a teacher. It showed him the difference between cleverness and wisdom, between brilliance and endurance. It reminded him that in war and in life, those who survive longest are not always the fastest or the most elegant, but the ones who refuse to break. He wrote about the strange moment during his first test flight, when he realized he was flying something he couldn't destroy. "I pulled it into a dive," he recalled, "faster and faster, until the controls grew heavy, the wings shook, and the air screamed. I thought it would tear apart, but it didn't. It simply refused. And in that moment, I understood why we were losing the war. Because we built things that impressed, and they built things that endured." The article became unexpectedly popular. Pilots from both sides of the old war wrote to him. Some thanked him, others argued, but almost all admitted that he was right. The P-47 was never meant to be beautiful, it was meant to be eternal. Hans spent his final years near Lake Constance, living quietly. But every once in a while, when he heard the distant rumble of a propeller plane overhead, he'd look up and wonder if it was one of them. He knew most had been retired, scrapped, or sold off, yet the sound always made him smile. It was a sound that carried memories of fire and smoke, fear and awe, but also of revelation. Because to Hans Meyer, that thunder in the sky wasn't just an aircraft anymore. It was the echo of a truth he'd learned too late, that real power isn't about brilliance or beauty or even dominance. It's about endurance. It's about outlasting everything that tries to destroy you. And in that sense, the P-47 Thunderbolt didn't just win a war, it defined what it means to survive one. By the time Hans reached his 70s, aviation had changed so much, it was almost unrecognizable. The skies that once thundered with piston engines were now ruled by sleek jets that sliced through air too thin for breath. But the old pilot never quite let go of the past. Every new aircraft he saw, every innovation that claimed to be revolutionary, he weighed silently against one memory, that stubborn, thunderous beast of a plane he'd flown decades ago. He had seen the jet age rise, and with it, a new kind of arrogance, the same arrogance that had once doomed his country. Engineers were obsessed again with speed, altitude, cutting-edge materials. But as Hans read about crashes, malfunctions, systems that failed because they were too complex to maintain, he realized something. Progress had forgotten humility. Machines were faster, yes, but few were as honest as the old Thunderbolt. One day, in the late 1970s, he received an invitation from an American aviation museum. They were holding a veterans exhibition, Allied and Axis pilots alike, and they wanted him to attend. There would be Spitfires, Mustangs, Messerschmitts, and yes, a restored P-47 Thunderbolt. The letter said they'd heard of his article, "The Machine That Taught Me Humility," and wanted him to share his perspective. Hans almost didn't go. He was older now, slower, walking with a cane. But curiosity, that same restless instinct that once drove him to steal an unauthorized flight in wartime, refused to die. So he went. The museum hangar was alive with sound that day. Laughter, engines starting for demonstration, the low hum of memories reawakening in old men's eyes. The smell of fuel and metal hit him like déjà vu. And there it was, the Thunderbolt, standing proud, silver gleaming under the spotlights, its massive propeller casting long shadows across the floor. The sight stopped him in his tracks. It looked even larger than he remembered, almost prehistoric in its proportions. But when he ran his hand along the fuselage, it was like touching time itself. His fingers traced rivets and panels, each one speaking a language of endurance he still understood. The curator approached and smiled. "This one flew with the 56th Fighter Group," he said. "Escorted bombers over Germany, brought its pilot home every time." Hans didn't reply immediately. He just nodded and whispered, "Of course it did." They let him climb the small ladder up to the cockpit. It wasn't easy, his legs trembled, But the moment he sat inside, the years melted away. The switches, the dials, the levers, it was all the same. The seat felt small now, his body frail and worn, but the sensation was the same. Safety through strength. He ran his hand across the control stick and remembered every vibration, every roar. A young American pilot, probably no older than 25, stood below, watching him with curiosity. "Sir," he called out, "you really flew one of these during the war?" Hans looked down, smiled faintly, and said, "No, son, I flew against them, but I learned more from this plane than from any I ever called my own." The young pilot looked confused, so Hans gestured for him to come closer. "You see," he said quietly, "this machine was not about glory. It was about forgiveness. You could make mistakes, and it would still bring you home. Our planes," he paused, his voice faltering, "they were beautiful. But beauty doesn't care if you live or die." That evening, they invited Hans to speak on stage. Under the soft glow of hangar lights, surrounded by old pilots and their families, he told his story. He spoke of that captured Thunderbolt in 1944, of flying it through fog and fear, of discovering what true engineering humility looked like. His voice trembled at times, but every word carried weight. He ended his speech with a sentence that silenced the room. The P-47 didn't win because it was better. It won because it was built to endure imperfection. And that, my friends, is what victory really means. The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was deep, respectful. Several American veterans stood to shake his hand. One of them, an old Thunderbolt pilot with trembling fingers, told him, "You're the first German I've ever heard speak of her like that." Hans just smiled and replied, "She didn't belong to one side. She belonged to everyone who believed in survival." After the event, they offered to let him watch the plane fly. He hesitated. His heart couldn't take much excitement anymore, but he agreed. When the engine roared to life, the same deep, thunderous growl shook the ground beneath him. The propeller blurred, the hangar doors opened, and the Thunderbolt began to roll down the runway. Slowly at first, then faster, until it lifted gracefully into the sky. Hans felt his throat tighten. It was like seeing an old friend rise from the grave. The aircraft climbed steadily, turning into the golden sunset, its silhouette sharp against the horizon. For a few seconds, it was 1944 again. The sky belonged to thunder. As it disappeared into the clouds, Hans realized something he'd never put into words before. The P-47 wasn't just a weapon, it was a metaphor. For the war, for humanity, for himself. It represented the truth he'd come to accept, that the greatest strength doesn't come from perfection or brilliance, but from the ability to keep flying when everything around you falls apart. He left the museum that evening quietly, saying goodbye to no one. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of engines over the hills. And as he looked up, the stars beginning to emerge, he whispered to himself, "You were right, old friend. You really were indestructible." A few years later, when Hans passed away peacefully in his sleep, they found among his few possessions a notebook. On the last page, written in his shaky handwriting, were the words, "To endure is to conquer. The Thunderbolt taught me that." That notebook now sits in the same museum he once visited, displayed beside the aircraft that changed him. And if you ever find yourself there, standing before that giant silver bird, look closely at the small inscription beneath the display glass. It reads, "He flew the enemy's machine and discovered what victory truly meant." Because for Hans Meyer, and for all those who ever faced that roar in the sky, the P-47 Thunderbolt was not just an airplane. It was a reminder that even in war, there are lessons greater than destruction. Lessons of endurance, humility, and the quiet kind of power that never stops flying, even when the world burns beneath it.